Hi, my name is Patrick Reagan. Welcome to the Operating System's Windows Services, where we discuss common services provided by Windows, including Active Directory, the managing of files and folders, and managing printers. In Part 2, Understanding NTFS Permissions covers NTFS permissions, explicit permissions, inherited permissions, and effective permissions. It also discusses how to take ownership of a file or folder. For those who are going to take the A+ exam, there are practice questions toward the end of the video. The NTFS File Permission tool is powerful and enables you to control access to your files and folders, whether they're accessed across the network or by someone logging onto the computer locally. These permissions are available in volumes formatted with the NTFS file system. To see and manage file and folder permissions, right-click the file and folder, click Properties, and click the Security tab. The available standard NTFS permissions are Read, Read and Execute, Write, Modify, List Folder Contents, and Full Control. The Read permission allows the user to read the contents of the folder or file. The Read and Execute permission allows the user to read the contents of the folder or file, as well as execute a program. The Write permissions allows you to create files and folders and write to a file, while the Modify permissions allows you to read and write, delete files, and view content. The List Folder Contents only allows you to view a list of files in a folder. The Full Control permissions have all permissions, including adding, changing, and removing permissions on the files and folders. Each of the standard permissions gives the logical group of advanced permissions. To see advanced permissions, right-click the file or folder, click Properties, and click the Security tab. Click Advanced button and click Add. After you select the principal, the standard NTFS permissions are showing. To show the advanced NTFS permissions, click Show Advanced Permissions. To see a breakdown of the standard NTFS permissions to advanced permissions, visit the site shown on the screen. To simplify administration, you can use groups to grant permissions. By assigning NTFS permissions to a group, you're granting permissions to one or more people simultaneously, reducing the number of entries in each access list, as well as the amount of effort required to grant multiple people access to certain files or folders. If you have a group assigned to multiple folders, by adding a person to that group, the user will get all of the permissions granted to the group. There are two types of permissions used in NTFS. Explicit permissions are permissions granted directly to a file or folder. Inherited permissions are permissions that are granted to a folder, parent object or container that flow into the child objects, subfolders or files inside the parent folder. In a file system, a folder with subfolders is considered the parent folder of the subfolders, while the subfolders are considered child folders. By default, after you set permissions on a parent folder, new files and subfolders that are created in the folder inherit those permissions. As you can see in the example on the screen, the Allow Full Control permission was granted or explicitly assigned on folder 1. By default, the Allow Full Control permissions will flow down to the subfolders and files below folder 1. Therefore, folder 2, folder 3, and file 1, which is inside folder 3, inherit the Allow Full Control permissions. If you grant different explicit permissions at a lower level, the lower level permissions take precedence. In this example, Allow Full Control permissions granted on folder 1. The Allow Full Control permissions will normally flow down to folder 2. However, since the read permission for the user group was actually assigned or granted explicitly, that becomes the new permissions for the folder 2 level, and that permission allows read will flow down to folders 3 and file 1. If a user has access to a file, he or she can still gain access to the file, even if he or she does not have access to the folder containing the file. Of course, because the user doesn't have access to the folder, the user cannot navigate or browse through the folder to get to the file. Therefore, the user will have to know and use the universal naming convention or local path to open the file. When you view permissions of a file or folder, they will appear in one of the following ways. Checked, which means permissions are explicitly assigned. Cleared or unchecked means no permissions are assigned. Shaded permissions are granted through inheritance from a parent folder. Besides granting the allowed permissions, you can also grant the deny permission. The deny permission always overrides other permissions that have been granted, including when a user group has been given full control. For example, if a group is granted read and write permission, and one person within the group is denied the write permission, the user's effective permission is the read permission. When you combine applying deny versus allowed with explicit versus inherited permissions, the hierarchy of precedence of permissions is as follows: explicit deny, explicit allow, inherited deny, inherited allow. Because users can be members of several groups, it is possible for them to have several sets of explicit permissions for a particular folder or file. When this occurs, the permissions are combined to form the effective permissions, which are the actual permissions when logging in and accessing a file or folder. These consist of explicit permissions plus any inherited permissions. When you calculate effective permissions, you must first calculate the explicit and inherited permissions for an individual or group and then combine them. When combining user and group permissions for NTFS permissions, the effective permissions is the commutative permissions. The only exception is that deny permissions always apply. If you have a folder called Data, in which you have folder 1, and in which you have folder 2, in which you have folder 3. User 1 is a member of group 1 and 2. You assign allow write permissions to the data folder to user 1, allow read permissions to folder 1 to group 1, allow modify permissions to folder 2 to group 2. To calculate effective permissions, you go across the level by level. User 1 was granted the allow write permission, user 1 was the allow write permissions, and no one else in group 1 and 2 have permissions to the data folder. For folder 1, the user 1 allow write permissions flows down to folder 1, and group 1 was granted the allow read permissions to folder 1. Therefore, user 1 was allowed the read and write at folder 1. For folder 2, group 2 is granted the allow modify permissions, while the allow write and allow read permissions has flown down to folder 2. The allow modify permissions granted will allow user 1 to read, write, change, and delete to folder 2. No permissions were granted directly to file 1, and all permissions are inherited from folder 2. Therefore, user 1 has the allow modify permissions to file 1. Here is another example, similar to the last example, but for folder 2, the deny modify permissions is granted to folder 2. The data folder and folder 1 remain unchanged. For folder 1, the user 1 allow write permissions flows down to folder 1, and group 1 was granted the allow read permissions to folder 1. Therefore, user 1 has the allow read and write at folder 1. For folder 2, the allow read and write would be inherited from the parent folder. However, since the deny modify permissions was explicitly granted to folder 2, user 1 has the deny modify permissions. Therefore, the effective permission of user 1 is that he or she will not be able to read, write, or modify the folder 2 in file 1. In Windows, the Effective Access tab has been added to enable you to view the effective NTFS permissions for a user, group, or device account on a resource. To access this tab, right-click the file or folder, choose Properties, click the Security tab, and click Advanced. Click the Effective Access Permissions tab, specify user or group, and then click the View Effective Access button. To stop inheritance of permissions to stop from flowing from the parent folder, you can open the folder or file properties. Click the Advanced button, click the Disable Inheritance button, select the Replace All Child Object Permissions entries with Inheritable Permissions entries from this object option. Select either Convert Inherited Permissions into Explicit Permissions on this object, or remove all inherited permissions from this object. Click OK. To enable inheritance, you just click the Enable Inheritance button. To view the permissions of a folder, right-click Folder 1 and click Properties. Then click the Security tab. As you can see, that authenticated users has inherited modified permissions, which includes read and execute, list folder contents, read and write permissions. When you click Group 1 has been explicitly granted the read and execute permissions, list folder contents, and read permissions. To explicitly grant permissions, click the Add button, specify a user or group, and then specify the permissions you want to grant. To see the effect of permissions, open the Properties, click the Security tab, click the Advanced button, and click the Effective Access tab. Then specify a user or group, and then click View Effective Access. To stop inheritance, first view the permissions granted to Folder 1. Then move to Folder 2 Properties, open Properties, select the Security tab, and click the Advanced button. To stop permissions from inheriting, click the Disable Inheritance button and select Convert Inherited Permissions into Explicit Permissions on this object. Since the permissions were copied from above, which means the permissions were converted from inherited to explicit. If you are an administrator on the computer, you will have the Take Ownership right. The owner of the object controls how permissions are set on the object and to whom permissions are granted. If for some reason access to a file or folder has been denied and the permissions needs to be reset, take ownership of a file or folder and modify the permissions. To take ownership, right-click the folder or file and click Properties. Click the Security tab and click the Advanced button. At the top of the Advanced Security Settings dialog box, for the owner, click Change. In the Select User or Group select box, specify the group or user and click OK. Select the Replace a Owner on Containers and Objects option, and select the Replace All Child Object Permissions entries with Inheritable Permissions entries from this object option. Click OK. This slide shows how to use the Take Ownership process. Question: which of the following NTFS security settings overrides all other settings? Answer: deny. Question: which minimum permission is needed to change permissions of a folder? Answer: full control. Question: what is the minimum permission needed to delete a file? Answer: modify. Question: you create a new folder and you want that folder to have different NTFS permissions than its parent folders. What should you change? Answer: inheritance. Question: which permission overwrites an inherited permission? Answer: explicit permissions. Question: you have a folder on an NTFS volume. The administrators group has granted full control to the folder. You then grant the deny, write, and modify permissions to the folder to a user who is a member of the administrators group. What is the effective permissions for the user? Answer: none. For more information, visit these sites. In summary, the NTFS File Permissions tool is a powerful and enables you to control access to your files and folders, whether accessed across the network or by someone logging onto the computer locally. To simplify administration, you can use groups to grant permissions. Explicit permissions are permissions granted directly to a file or folder. Inherited permissions are permissions that are granted to a folder that flow into the child's objects. The deny permissions always overrides other permissions that have been granted, including when a user or group has been given full control. When combining user and group permissions for NTFS security, the effective permissions is the commutative permissions. If access to a file or folder has been denied, the permission needs to be reset. Take ownership of a file or folder and modify the permissions. Thank you for watching this video. The next video will be Windows Services Part 3, Understanding Windows Shared Folders. Thank you.